Imagine a man so terrifying that mothers used his name to scare children into obedience. A warrior so feared that the greatest empire in human history, Rome, paid him millions in gold just to stay away. A conqueror so devastating that grass never grew where his horse had trodden. His name was Attila. The Romans called him flagellum Dei, the Scourge of God. A divine punishment sent to humble the arrogant. And for 20 brutal years in the 5th century, he made the entire Western world tremble. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. Attila wasn't just some barbarian leading a horde of mindless savages. He was a brilliant strategist who turned a fractured confederation of nomadic tribes into the most powerful military force in the world. He spoke multiple languages. He negotiated with emperors. He understood Roman politics better than most Romans. And he came within a hair's breadth of destroying Western civilization completely. Think about that. One man. One decision. And the entire trajectory of European history changes forever. This isn't just ancient history. This is the story of how a single individual with absolute will and tactical genius can bring the mightiest empire to its knees. How fear can be weaponized more effectively than any sword. How the barbarians nearly erased everything Rome had built over 1,000 years. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how Attila rose from nothing to become the most feared man on earth. How he played 2 Roman emperors against each other like puppets. Why his army was unstoppable. And what his story reveals about power, empire, and the thin line between civilization and chaos. Because Attila's legacy isn't about destruction. It's about what happens when an underestimated outsider refuses to play by the rules of the establishment. Let's dive in. To understand Attila, you need to understand the world he was born into, a world that was already collapsing. The year is approximately 406 CE. The Roman Empire, which had dominated the known world for over 500 years, is dying. Not quickly. Not dramatically. But slowly, like a great tree being hollowed out by termites. The empire had split into 2 halves decades earlier. The Western Roman Empire, headquartered in Rome and later Ravenna, and the Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople. They were supposed to be 2 parts of the same whole, but in reality, they competed more than they cooperated. The Western Empire was broke. Decades of civil wars, plague, economic collapse, and barbarian invasions had drained its treasury and shattered its legions. The mighty Roman army that had conquered the Mediterranean world was now largely composed of Germanic barbarian mercenaries who felt no loyalty to Rome. The Eastern Empire was wealthier, more stable, better defended. Constantinople was protected by massive walls and controlled rich trade routes. But it too faced constant pressure from Persian enemies in the east and barbarian tribes in the north. And those barbarian tribes? They were on the move. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians, Saxons, Alans, entire nations were migrating across Europe, fleeing from something even more terrifying than Rome. The Huns. The Huns had appeared on the edges of Europe decades before Attila's birth, emerging from the vast Eurasian steppes like a nightmare made flesh. They were nomadic horsemen, masters of the composite bow, capable of shooting arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. They didn't fight like Romans. They didn't build cities or follow the civilized rules of warfare. They would appear out of nowhere, destroy everything in their path, and vanish before anyone could mount a defense. The Goths, who had themselves been terrorizing Rome, were so frightened of the Huns that they begged the Roman Empire for permission to cross the Danube River and settle inside Roman territory. Rome agreed. And that decision would prove catastrophic. In 378 CE, those same Goths revolted and destroyed a Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople, killing Emperor Valens in the process. It was one of Rome's worst military defeats in history. The empire was reeling. And into this world of chaos, somewhere around 406 CE in the Hunnic heartland north of the Danube, Attila was born. Here's the frustrating thing about Attila: we know almost nothing about his early life. The Huns had no written language. They left no chronicles, no histories, no records. Everything we know about Attila comes from Roman and Greek sources, written by his enemies. Imagine trying to understand Winston Churchill by only reading Nazi propaganda. That's essentially what we're doing with Attila. What we do know is that Attila was born into Hunnic royalty. His uncle Rugila was the king of the Huns, and his father Munzuk was a chieftain of significant importance. The Huns were organized into a complex confederation of tribes. They weren't a unified nation in the modern sense, but rather a collection of clans bound together by loyalty to powerful leaders. Leadership was earned through strength, cunning, and success in warfare. As a boy, Attila would have learned the essential skills of a Hunnic warrior: horsemanship, archery, tracking, survival. Hunnic children could ride before they could walk. They learned to shoot a bow from horseback while moving at full speed. They could survive for days on nothing but mare's milk and dried meat. But Attila learned something else too, something that would set him apart from every other Hunnic leader. He learned about Rome. As a young man, possibly as a teenager, Attila was sent to the Roman court as a hostage. This was common practice in the ancient world. Powerful barbarian families would send their sons to live in Rome as a guarantee of good behavior. In exchange, these hostages received Roman education and exposure to imperial politics. Attila spent years in the heart of the empire. He learned Latin. He studied Roman military tactics. He watched how the imperial bureaucracy worked. He saw the corruption, the infighting, the weakness beneath Rome's grand facade. Most importantly, he learned that Rome was terrified of the Huns. And he learned how to exploit that fear. When Attila returned to his people, he wasn't just another barbarian warrior. He was someone who understood both worlds, the Hunnic culture of his birth and the Roman system he would eventually bring to its knees. In 434 CE, King Rugula died. Power passed to his nephews, Attila and his older brother Bleda. They ruled jointly at first, as co-kings. This arrangement was actually common among the Huns, who often had multiple leaders sharing power. But shared power rarely lasts. The brothers immediately began consolidating their position. They renegotiated the treaty their uncle had with the Eastern Roman Empire, demanding triple the previous tribute payment. Instead of £350 of gold annually, they now demanded £700. The Eastern Roman Emperor, Theodosius II, was weak and preferred buying peace to fighting for it. He agreed. Think about that for a moment. The mighty Roman Empire, the civilization that had conquered most of the known world, was now paying protection money to barbarians. But Attila wasn't satisfied with just tribute. He wanted total dominance over the Hunnic Confederation. And his brother Bleda stood in the way. Around 445 CE, Bleda died under mysterious circumstances during a hunting trip. The official story was that it was an accident. But nobody believed that. Attila had murdered his own brother. In Roman society, this would have been seen as an unforgivable crime, a stain on one's honor. But in the brutal world of Hunnic politics, it was pragmatic. Attila had eliminated a rival and consolidated all power in his own hands. Now he was the sole ruler of the Hunnic Empire. And he had plans. Attila understood something that most conquerors miss: terror is more effective than violence. If you're frightening enough, cities will surrender without a fight. If your reputation precedes you, enemies will flee before you arrive. So Attila deliberately cultivated an image of supernatural horror. He claimed to possess the Sword of Mars, a legendary weapon supposedly given to him by the god of war himself. According to Hunnic legend, a shepherd had found the sword buried in the earth, and when he brought it to Attila, it was recognized as a divine sign that Attila was destined to rule the world. Was this story true? Probably not. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that people believed it. Attila also cultivated a personal mystique. Roman observers described him as short and stocky with a large head, small eyes, a thin beard, and a flat nose. By Roman standards, he was ugly. But Attila used this to his advantage. He didn't try to imitate Roman emperors with their purple robes and golden crowns. He dressed simply, often in plain leather and furs. While his generals adorned themselves with Roman spoils, Attila remained austere. This made him seem more dangerous, not less. He didn't need to prove his power through displays of wealth. His reputation did that for him. Before we go further, you need to understand why the Hunnic army was so devastating. The Romans had faced many enemies over the centuries: Germanic tribes, Persians, Carthaginians. They had developed tactics to deal with infantry, cavalry, elephants, chariots, everything. But the Huns were different. The core of the Hunnic army was the horse archer. These warriors could shoot with incredible accuracy while riding at full gallop. They used composite bows, made from wood, horn, and sinew, that could penetrate Roman armor at 100 yards. Their standard tactic was the feigned retreat. They would attack, fire a volley of arrows, then turn and flee. Enemy forces, thinking the Huns were defeated, would break formation to pursue. That's when the Huns would wheel around and slaughter them. The Romans called this tactic Parthian shot, because the Parthian cavalry had used similar methods. But the Huns perfected it to an art form. But the Hunnic army wasn't just Huns. This is crucial to understand. Attila commanded a multinational confederation. His forces included Goths, Gepids, Alans, Sarmatians, Heruli, Rugi, and dozens of other tribes. Many of these tribes had been conquered by the Huns, but others allied with Attila voluntarily because he offered them plunder and glory. This gave Attila incredible military flexibility. He had the mobility of Hunnic horse archers combined with the heavy infantry and cavalry of Germanic tribes. He could adapt his tactics to any situation. The Hunnic army also traveled with minimal baggage. They lived off the land, which meant they could move faster than any Roman force. By the time Rome mobilized a response, Attila would already be gone. And when Attila's forces besieged a city, they were brutal. The Huns would surround a settlement and demand surrender. If the city submitted, they would be required to pay tribute but would generally be left intact. If they resisted, the Huns would destroy them completely. No mercy. No survivors. Buildings razed. Fields salted. This created a horrifying incentive structure. Resist and die, or surrender and live. Most chose to surrender. In 441 CE, Attila launched his first major campaign against the Eastern Roman Empire. His justification was characteristically clever. He claimed that the Bishop of Margus had crossed the Danube and desecrated Hunnic royal tombs, stealing treasure. He demanded the bishop be handed over. The Romans refused. So Attila attacked. His forces swept through the Balkans like a wildfire. City after city fell. Margus, Singidunum, modern Belgrade, Sirmium, major Roman settlements were burned to the ground. The Romans tried to stop him. They sent armies. Every single one was defeated. Attila's forces reached the walls of Constantinople itself. The great city, protected by its legendary triple walls, was the one place Attila couldn't easily conquer. But he didn't need to. Emperor Theodosius II sued for peace. The new treaty was humiliating for Rome. Annual tribute increased to 2,100 pounds of gold. A one-time payment of 6,000 pounds of gold for missed tribute. All Roman deserters who had fled to Hunnic territory had to be returned. Rome could not form alliances with any tribes hostile to the Huns. Roman markets had to be open to Hunnic merchants. Think about what this means. The Eastern Roman Empire, one of the most powerful states on earth, was now effectively a tributary of the Huns. And Attila had achieved this without even conquering Constantinople. Just by threatening it. For a few years, there was peace. Attila took his tribute and focused on consolidating his empire. He established his capital at a location somewhere in modern-day Hungary. The exact location has never been found. Roman ambassadors who visited described a surprisingly sophisticated court. Attila lived in a large wooden palace. He held feasts where business was conducted. He had advisors, administrators, scribes. This wasn't a chaotic barbarian horde. It was an empire. One Roman diplomat, Priscus of Panium, left detailed accounts of his visit to Attila's court in 448 CE. His descriptions are our most valuable source for understanding Attila's personality and methods. Priscus described Attila as shrewd, calculating, and in complete control. During negotiations, Attila would alternate between rage and reason, keeping the Romans off balance. He understood psychological manipulation. But Priscus also noted something interesting. Attila showed loyalty to those who served him well and mercy to those who submitted without resistance. He wasn't just a mindless destroyer. He was building something. However, his relationship with the Eastern Empire was about to change dramatically. In 449 CE, something extraordinary happened that reveals just how desperate Rome had become. Emperor Theodosius II's sister, Honoria, had a problem. She'd been caught in an affair with her chamberlain and was being forced into an unwanted marriage as punishment. In desperation, she sent a secret message to Attila. She sent him her ring and asked for his help. Now, Honoria probably meant this as a plea for intervention. Maybe she hoped Attila would pressure her brother to cancel the marriage. But Attila interpreted it differently. He claimed that by sending her ring, Honoria had proposed marriage to him. And he accepted. Furthermore, Attila demanded half of the Western Roman Empire as Honoria's dowry. The Romans were horrified. They refused. They said Honoria had no authority to make such an agreement, that women couldn't inherit imperial power, that the whole thing was absurd. Attila didn't care. He now had a justification for war against the Western Empire. But before that war could begin, something else happened. The Eastern Romans hatched a plan to solve their Attila problem permanently. They would assassinate him. Emperor Theodosius sent an embassy to Attila's court, led by a man named Edico, who was actually one of Attila's own generals. The Romans bribed Edico with gold and convinced him to murder Attila. The plan was discovered. Attila could have executed the entire Roman embassy. He could have launched an immediate invasion. But instead, he did something more clever. He sent the would-be assassins back to Constantinople with a message: "I know what you tried to do. And now you owe me." He exposed the plot publicly, humiliating Theodosius. The emperor was forced to send even more gold as an apology and to promise never to attempt such treachery again. Attila had turned an assassination attempt into another diplomatic victory. But his patience with the Eastern Empire was wearing thin. And in 450 CE, an opportunity presented itself. Emperor Theodosius II fell off his horse during a hunting trip and died from his injuries. His successor, Marcian, was a former soldier who refused to continue paying tribute to the Huns. Marcian sent Attila a message: "I have gold for my friends and iron for my enemies." It was a declaration of defiance. Attila could have invaded the Eastern Empire again. But he made a different calculation. The Western Empire was weaker, more divided, and now he had his excuse with Honoria's proposal. Plus, the Eastern Empire's new walls and reformed army would make an invasion costly. So Attila turned west. He was going to invade Gaul. In early 451 CE, Attila assembled the largest army he had ever commanded. Ancient sources claim it was 500,000 men. Modern historians think it was probably closer to 100,000 to 150,000, but even that was enormous for the time. His forces included Huns, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Rugi, Heruli, Thuringians, Alans, Burgundians, and more. It was a multinational coalition held together by loyalty to Attila and the promise of Roman plunder. They crossed the Rhine River and invaded Gaul, modern France. The devastation was immediate and total. Metz was sacked. Reims burned. Mines destroyed. Strasbourg fell. Trier, Cologne, Tournai, city after city was put to the torch. Ancient sources describe Attila's army advancing in a line so wide that they would devastate everything in their path. Entire regions were depopulated. Churches and monasteries that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. The people of Gaul were paralyzed with terror. Refugees fled south, bringing stories of Hunnic atrocities that grew more horrific with each retelling. Attila marched on Orleans, a major city on the Loire River. If Orleans fell, the path to the heart of Gaul would be open. But something unexpected happened. The Western Roman Empire finally found a leader capable of opposing Attila. His name was Flavius Aetius, and he was the closest thing Rome had to a military genius in the 5th century. Aetius had actually spent time as a hostage with the Huns as a young man, just like Attila. The two men knew each other. Some sources even suggest they had been friends. But now they were enemies. Aetius understood that he couldn't defeat Attila with Roman forces alone. The Western Roman army was a shadow of its former self, composed mostly of Germanic foederati, allied barbarian troops. So Aetius did something brilliant. He assembled a coalition. He convinced the Visigoths, who had settled in southwestern Gaul and had their own reasons to fear the Huns, to join him. He brought in Alans, Franks, Burgundians, Saxons. Essentially, he united all the barbarian tribes of Gaul against Attila. When Attila's forces reached Orleans, they found the city reinforced and an army marching to its relief. Attila made a calculated decision. Instead of besieging Orleans, he withdrew to find better ground for battle. The two armies met on the Catalonian plains, near the city of Troyes. It would be one of the bloodiest battles in European history. The exact date is uncertain, but sometime in June 451 CE, two massive armies faced each other on the plains of northeastern Gaul. On one side, Attila commanding his Hunnic confederation. On the other, Aetius leading his Roman barbarian coalition, with King Theodoric of the Visigoths as his co-commander. Ancient sources claim that anywhere from 300,000 to 500,000 men fought in this battle. Modern estimates are more conservative, probably 100,000 total, but even that would make it one of the largest battles of the entire ancient world. The fighting began in the afternoon. Both sides rushed to control a ridge of high ground that dominated the battlefield. Attila's forces seized part of the ridge first, but Aetius's coalition captured the highest point. This gave them a crucial tactical advantage. Attila placed his elite Hunnic cavalry in the center, with his Gothic and Gepid allies on the flanks. Aetius positioned the Visigoths on his right wing, the Alans in the center, and his Romans and Franks on the left. The battle was chaos. The Visigoths crashed into Attila's left flank with devastating force. King Theodoric personally led the charge, but he was thrown from his horse and trampled to death by his own cavalry. His death could have broken the Visigothic line, but instead it enraged them. Theodoric's son Thorismund took command and fought with even greater fury, determined to avenge his father. In the center, Attila's Hunnic cavalry engaged the Alans in brutal close combat. The Huns' traditional hit-and-run tactics were useless in such a packed melee. This was grinding, face-to-face slaughter. On Attila's right flank, his Gothic allies initially pushed back the Roman forces but couldn't break through. As evening approached, Attila's forces were being pushed back. The battle was turning against him. This had never happened before. Attila had never lost. As darkness fell, Attila withdrew his forces to his fortified camp, which was protected by a circle of wagons. Roman sources claim he prepared a funeral pyre from horse saddles, determined to burn himself alive rather than be captured if the camp was overrun. But Aetius didn't press the attack. As night fell, both armies pulled back. Why didn't Aetius finish Attila? This question has puzzled historians for centuries. Some suggest Aetius was worried about losing control of his coalition if victory was too complete. The Visigoths had lost their king. If the Huns were destroyed, the balance of power in Gaul would shift unpredictably. Others suggest that Aetius, who had grown up among the Huns, couldn't bring himself to destroy Attila completely. The most cynical theory is that Aetius wanted the Hunnic threat to remain so that he would continue to be indispensable to the Western Roman Empire. Whatever the reason, when morning came, Attila's army was still intact. Over the next few days, he conducted a fighting retreat back across the Rhine. Ancient sources claim that 165,000 men died at the Catalonian plains. Modern historians think the real number was probably 30,000 to 50,000. But the strategic result was clear: Attila had been stopped. For the first time in his career, he had failed to achieve his objective. The myth of Hunnic invincibility had been shattered. But Attila wasn't finished. Not even close. In 452 CE, just 1 year after the Catalonian plains, Attila invaded Italy. If he couldn't have Gaul, he would have Rome itself. His justification was still the same: he demanded Honoria as his bride and half the Western Empire as her dowry. But everyone knew this was just an excuse. Attila wanted revenge for his defeat in Gaul. He wanted to prove that the setback at the Catalonian plains was just a temporary obstacle. And he wanted to loot the wealthiest region in the Western world. Attila's army crossed the Alps and descended into the Po River Valley in northern Italy. The first major city in their path was Aquileia, one of the wealthiest and most heavily fortified cities in the region. Aquileia's walls were formidable. The city had massive supplies. Its defenders were confident they could hold out until relief arrived. Attila laid siege. Weeks passed. The city didn't fall. Attila's forces were growing restless. Some of his allies suggested abandoning the siege and raiding easier targets. According to legend, Attila was about to give the order to withdraw when he noticed something. A stork flew away from the city walls carrying her chicks. To Attila, this was an omen. Even the birds knew the city was doomed. He ordered his forces to intensify the assault. They built siege towers, filled in sections of the moat, and bombarded the walls day and night. Finally, the walls were breached. Attila's forces poured into Aquileia. The sack of Aquileia was so complete that ancient sources claim the city was erased from existence. Modern archaeology confirms that Aquileia never fully recovered. It went from being a major city to a minor village. After Aquileia, the other cities of northern Italy fell like dominoes. Padua, Verona, Brescia, Bergamo, all were sacked or ransomed. Milan, one of the great cities of the empire, opened its gates and paid an enormous tribute to avoid destruction. Then Attila marched on Rome itself. The Western Roman Emperor, Valentinian III, fled to Ravenna. The Senate panicked. The people of Rome prepared for the worst. But then something extraordinary happened. Pope Leo I, later known as Leo the Great, led a delegation to meet Attila before his army reached Rome. What happened at this meeting is one of history's great mysteries. The meeting took place somewhere near the Mincio River in northern Italy. Pope Leo I, accompanied by 2 Roman senators, rode out to negotiate with the Scourge of God. Ancient Christian sources describe the meeting in miraculous terms. They claim that when Leo spoke, the apostles Peter and Paul appeared in the sky behind him, brandishing flaming swords and threatening Attila with death if he didn't turn back. Attila, terrified by this divine vision, agreed to spare Rome. That's the legend. The reality was probably more pragmatic. First, Attila's army was suffering from disease. Italian summers were hot and marshy, perfect breeding grounds for malaria and dysentery. His forces, which had been campaigning for months, were weakening. Second, the Eastern Roman Empire had sent forces to attack Hunnic territory back home. Attila couldn't afford to have his base of power threatened while he was deep in enemy territory. Third, Aetius was assembling another coalition army. If Attila advanced on Rome and got bogged down in a siege, he could be trapped. Fourth, And this is speculation, but interesting speculation. Attila may have remembered what happened to Alaric the Visigoth. In 410 CE, Alaric had sacked Rome. It was a shocking moment that reverberated across the empire. But Alaric died shortly afterward, possibly from disease contracted in Italy. Some saw it as divine retribution. Maybe Attila was superstitious enough to worry about the same fate. Whatever the reason, Attila agreed to Leo's terms. He would withdraw from Italy in exchange for a massive payment of gold and a promise that Honoria would be given to him as a bride. This was, of course, a lie. The Romans had no intention of actually giving Honoria to Attila. But it gave both sides a face-saving way to end the campaign. Attila withdrew across the Alps, his army laden with Italian plunder. In the Christian tradition, this became one of the defining moments of papal history. Leo I had saved Rome not with armies but with faith and diplomacy. It established the Pope as a temporal power, not just a spiritual leader. But from Attila's perspective, he had achieved his goals. He had ravaged Italy, collected enormous tribute, and avoided the risks of besieging Rome. He returned to his capital in triumph, planning his next campaign. He would invade the Eastern Roman Empire again. He would make Emperor Marcian regret refusing to pay tribute. But he would never get the chance. 453 CE. Attila's capital, somewhere in the Hungarian plain. Attila, now in his late 40s, decided to take another wife. He already had multiple wives. Polygamy was standard among Hunnic nobility, but this new bride was special. Her name was Ildiko, and she was young and beautiful. Gothic, possibly, or from another Germanic tribe that had allied with the Huns. The wedding feast was extravagant. Attila drank heavily, celebrating with his retinue. As the night wore on, he retired to his bedchamber with his new bride. The next morning, Attila didn't emerge. His guards waited. Hours passed. Finally, concerned, they broke down the door. They found Attila dead in his bed, lying in a pool of blood. Ildiko was huddled in the corner, terrified and sobbing. What happened? The official account, recorded by the historian Jordanes, who was writing a century later based on earlier sources, says that Attila suffered a severe nosebleed during the night. Too drunk to wake up properly, he choked on his own blood and died. It's a plausible explanation. Attila was a heavy drinker, and alcohol can cause nosebleeds. Choking on blood while unconscious is entirely possible. But many historians suspect murder. Think about it, a young woman forced into marriage with a barbarian warlord 3 times her age. A man responsible for the deaths of countless thousands. On her wedding night, she has the opportunity to strike. Did Ildiko stab Attila and then stage it to look like a nosebleed? We'll never know. The sources don't accuse her, possibly because the Huns didn't want to admit their great leader could be killed by a woman. Or maybe it really was just a tragic accident. Sometimes history is mundane like that. Either way, the result was the same. Attila the Hun, the Scourge of God, the man who had made empires tremble, was dead. His body was placed in 3 coffins, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron, symbolizing his conquests and wealth. According to tradition, the slaves who buried him were killed afterward so that his tomb's location would remain secret. To this day, Attila's burial place has never been found. Attila's death created an immediate succession crisis. He had multiple sons from different wives, and each had a claim to power. The eldest was Elac, but his brothers Dengizic and Ernak also demanded their share. The sons tried to rule jointly, but the coalition Attila had built immediately began to fracture. The subject peoples, Goths, Gepids, Rugians, Heruli, and others, had submitted to Attila because he was a singular force of nature. They had feared him personally. His sons commanded no such fear. In 454 CE, just 1 year after Attila's death, a massive rebellion erupted. The Gepids, led by King Ardaric, formed a coalition of subject peoples and challenged Hunnic dominance. They met Attila's sons at the Battle of Nedao River in Pannonia, modern Hungary. The result was a catastrophic defeat for the Huns. Elac, Attila's eldest son, was killed in battle. The Hunnic army was shattered. The subject peoples broke away. The Ostrogoths settled in Pannonia. The Gepids established their own kingdom. The Rugians, Heruli, and Siri each carved out territories. The Hunnic Empire, which had terrorized Europe for decades, disintegrated almost overnight. The remaining Huns, led by Dengizic and Ernak, retreated to the steppes north of the Black Sea. Dengizic tried to continue his father's legacy, raiding Roman territory and demanding tribute. But he was a pale shadow of Attila. In 469 CE, the Eastern Romans defeated and killed him. His head was displayed on a pole in Constantinople. Ernak, the last of Attila's sons, disappears from historical record. Some sources suggest he led his followers back to the Central Asian steppes from which the Huns had originally come. The Huns as a unified force vanished from history. Within a generation, they were gone. The people who had nearly destroyed the Roman Empire dissolved back into the obscurity from which they had emerged. It's one of the most dramatic collapses in history. An empire that existed for barely a century, held together entirely by the charisma and terror of one man. When that man died, everything fell apart. But here's the dark irony: even though the Huns were defeated, they still destroyed Rome. Just not in the way you might expect. Attila's invasions had devastated the Western Roman Empire economically and militarily. The richest provinces, Gaul and Italy, had been plundered. The tax base was shattered. The army was depleted. Worse, the power vacuum left by the Huns' collapse led to chaos. All those Germanic tribes that had been subjects of the Huns were now free to settle wherever they wanted. And they wanted to settle in Roman territory. The Vandals, who had fled from the Huns decades earlier, now controlled North Africa, the breadbasket of the Western Empire. They cut off Rome's grain supply. The Visigoths, who had fought alongside Rome against Attila, now expanded their kingdom in Spain and southern Gaul. The Burgundians established a kingdom in eastern Gaul. The Franks began their rise in northern Gaul. They